I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Hello and welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. For today's episode, I'll be speaking with RANE's Asia-Pacific analyst, Chase Blazek, about Japan's upcoming September leadership elections. Hi Chase, how are you?
Hey Emma, doing well. Good to talk to you again.
Good to talk to you as well. Can you start by explaining the key factors informing this race? Why isn't the current prime minister running, and who are the relevant candidates?
Yeah, the current prime minister kind of got the raw end of the deal. There was a campaign finance scandal in the party dating back to November 2023, and although it really wasn't primarily the fault of his faction or himself, the leader, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, he ended up having to fall on the sword here, and the party elders, assumedly in the background, led him to decide to step down and allow a new party leader to step up to lead the ruling Liberal Democratic Party and thus to become the next Prime Minister of Japan. And so that's where we are. We have an election coming up on September 27th. In the process of Kishida trying to manage this scandal over the last, roughly year, he dissolved LDP political factions, which have been a major driving factor between how elections get won and who gets political support from whom, both at the lawmaker level in the Diet, which is the parliament, and at the elder level, these sorts of like smoky backroom figures who have been around lots of elections, and their support matters quite a bit. So in this election, it's kind of unique. There aren't really factions, which hasn't been the case in any recent election that I know of, because these LDP factions have always been there in the background, but not so this time around. Of course, there are still LDP lawmakers who were formerly of these factions, but when you look at who they're supporting in this race, or who they've announced their support for, there's not very good factional unity. So it is indeed one of the first elections where factions are basically not a factor in the election, which means it's very difficult to forecast who's going to win this thing. That, and it's a crowded field. There's 9 candidates that have announced so far. Usually there's between 2 and 4 for these LDP leadership elections. That, and it's a 2-round election. So there's a first round where it goes half votes from the parliament and half votes from the people, mainly LDP voters. And in that round, this will get whittled down from 9 to 2 candidates. And then in the second round, it will be mainly the Diet, the parliament, who decides who wins. And that dynamic hasn't been too influential in past elections. But in this one, the most popular candidates are generally non-establishment figures, meaning they don't have particularly great relations with those elders I was talking about, or have very strong factional bases of their own. One of them is Shinjiro Koizumi, who's just generally viewed as too young to normally be prime minister. And then former defense minister Shigeru Ishiba is another one. Those two are basically 1 and 2 neck and neck in every poll for support for the next, for who voters would pick for the next prime minister. And neither of them are who the Diet would prefer. But if in this crowded first run race, the public votes for them more than anyone else, the Diet will be left having to choose between them, either them or maybe one of these more conservative establishment figures like Sane Takeichi. But again, whoever wins this thing is going to have to get through this first round very crowded field, which makes for a kind of a spicy election here.
If the 2 non-establishment leading figures who are leading in the polls are the 2 left standing, who do you think is most likely to be picked by the elders?
I think this is probably Shinjiro Koizumi. Though he is young, the other option, Shigeru Ishiba, is despised among elders in former factions. And though I already said the factions have sort of dissolved, their ghosts or their influence are still very much floating around the Diet. Shigeru Ishiba has run 5 times. This will be his 5th time trying to become prime minister, and every time he struggles quite a bit once it comes to the second round, where it's really the Diet who's deciding. So I think in that case, we would have one of the youngest, if not the youngest, Japanese prime ministers ever. And it would be definitely, a non-establishment figure here. This guy, his father was also the prime minister. He's not quite as much of a mover and shaker as Shigeru Ishiba as far as policy changes, but he wants to reform the party itself after its slush fund scandal. He wants to also reform the economy and economic policy to make the economy more fair toward households and middle and lower income folks, which is something that current Prime Minister Fumio Kishida said he would do on the campaign trail and tried to do in early policies, but the implementation always fell short. That could be who we're left with here, is the younger Shinjiro Koizumi.
What would an establishment versus a non-establishment foreign policy look like based on who's elected and who looks like they might win?
Yeah, well, thankfully, on foreign policy, as opposed to economic policy, on foreign policy, they're fairly similar views across the spectrum between non-establishment and establishment, young or old, what have you, among LDP candidates. The party itself and most of these candidates generally agree it's important to strengthen the U.S.-Japan military alliance. It's also important to strengthen the budding South Korea-Japan military partnership, which is a much newer development, and important to continue to strengthen Japan's military at home, which means continuing to consider constitutional revision to carve out a greater role for the military and beyond domestic affairs in Japan. And partnerships in general. So the domestic military strengthening and expanding Japan's military partnerships with, for example, the Philippines, Australia, Vietnam, what have you in the region via reciprocal access agreements or joint exercises, with the idea being Japan needs to prepare for a future in which China may take military action against Taiwan. And in that realm and in that potential future, Japan does not want to be caught flat-footed and needs to have a stronger military. So on a lot of those issues, any of these candidates would be fairly similar. Some of them are more ardent or more hawkish, some would say more bombastic in their support. For example, Shigeru Ishiba, this guy who's likely to make it through the first round, less likely to win the second round. He has traveled to Taiwan and shook hands with the Taiwanese president. It's generally a no-no for relations with China. And of course, him doing that in office as opposed to on the campaign trail would be two different things. But nonetheless, we can imagine if Shigeru Ishiba were to get into office, he could be much more disruptive to Japan's already pretty dicey relations with China, even more than we have seen, for example, by making some sort of formal defense cooperation or greater economic engagement with Taiwan beyond the sort of informal ties we have now.
You just kind of touched on this, but I was wondering if you could expand on how these candidates and the likely winners, I guess, would differ in foreign policy from the current Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida. Are there any major differences, or is it mostly going to be kind of the status quo of what's been happening so far?
Yeah, that's a good question. I really don't see too many major differences from Fumio Kishida. Mainly because, like I said earlier, most of these LDP candidates, including Fumio Kishida and his backers in the LDP, his political bigwig backers, they all sort of agree on these issues. It will be interesting to see how well the next prime minister manages the handoff between of Japan-South Korea relations, because as I was mentioning, this sort of budding and very new security relationship between South Korea and Japan under Kishida has been very much a top-level development, with Kishida meeting with South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and them managing this personal relationship as well as their country's military relations. So the next leader will have to sort of successfully manage the baton transfer in this relay race between leaders. But given this warming relationship is primarily facilitated by South Korea's willingness to put historical baggage between the two countries aside, I don't see this being a major issue. The most likely foreign policy changes we would see would actually be after the election. And if you'd like, I can sort of get into the snap election aspects here.
Yeah, what is there a high possibility of snap elections, or what are you looking out for there?
Well, generally, I'm kind of skeptical on the possibility of a snap election yet in 2024, just because there's been rampant talk about a snap election ever since May 2023, when Fumio Kishida hosted the G7 summit in Hiroshima. But he didn't call a snap election at that time, and ever since, every quarter there are calls, is going to happen now, is there going to be a snap election now? But ever since then, public support for the LDP has dropped precipitously. So to me, it would seem unwise to call a snap election at this point, because it's a fairly risky development. But we'll have to see. We've seen multiple statements from political analysts in sort of backroom or armchair quarterbacks of politics in Japan, saying that the LDP is going to wait until after the LDP leadership election and see what the polls say about the public support for this new guy or gal who's leading Japan as prime minister. If those polls suggest, yeah, the public's pretty happy with this person, they could call a snap election. I'm a little bit hesitant to say that there will be a big impact there, mainly because when you look at the public opinion polls in Japan, they consistently say top concerns of households are economic or cost of living issues, on which they grade the LDP as having performed relatively poorly in recent years. Social services and social support measures is usually second, which sort of goes along with cost of living issues, and they don't grade or assess the LDP to have done well there. And then political or campaign finance issues are generally third or fourth, so fairly far down on the list of voters and citizens' concerns. So in my opinion, it doesn't seem likely there's going to be a sudden surge in public support for the LDP, such that would justify a snap election. That said, people make mistakes all the time in politics. I mean, we've covered, at least this year and last at RANE, a number of snap elections in which we said, this would not be wise, and the party calls it nonetheless, and they do lose. So it's a possibility here that the LDP is a little bit illusioned about the chance to remake themselves through this LDP election and then afterward call a snap election. But to their credit, the opposition parties in Japan are perpetually disorganized and in their own disarray. They're even having the lead opposition party in Japan is having its own leadership election 4 days before the LDP leadership election, the Constitutional Democratic Party. So if they do call one, and I still think it's less than likely, so perhaps a 30-40% likelihood the LDP calls a snap election. If they do call one, it will be because they surmise that the opposition is even more disunited or disorganized than the LDP, and that even though the public doesn't love the LDP right now, they are skeptical of handing off the responsibility to this disorganized opposition. So that could be a calculus that could lead the LDP to call snap elections. And if they do and win, then that's great. We see general policy continuity. But if they call snap elections and lose, the Constitutional Democratic Party and other opposition parties are generally on the liberal end of the political spectrum, both economically and in social policy. And they're less in support, in general, of Japan's growing military role in the region. Some of them in the opposition recognize the necessity of the U.S.-Japan military alliance, but in general, they want to downplay this expanding military role for Japan and would seek, from many possible opposition leaders and would-be prime ministers from the opposition, would seek to improve Japan's relations with China and sort of scale back this expansion of Japanese military ties.
Aside from snap elections, are there any longer-term, high-impact, low-likelihood scenarios that you and the team are monitoring right now?
Snap elections are probably the big one here. There's also, and this is a risk every time there's a new prime minister in Japan, is a risk of returning to the periods of revolving door prime ministers of the early 2010s, late 2000s. In which you have these guys or gals, prime ministers, coming into office, and they last 12 to 18 months, and then someone new replaces them, then someone new replaces them. And though the LDP is fairly united, and so if these are, subsequent LDP prime ministers who are doing this, policy continuity is fairly likely. But nonetheless, it's not great for implementation from ministerial and governance implementation, but also for implementing Japan's foreign policy and foreign relationship goals if there's a new face at the helm of Japan every 12 to 18 months. So that's a risk here we want to watch for, and that's a risk that's been really alive and well ever since Shinzo Abe stepped down in 2020 and then was assassinated in 2022. The LDP has really not had this central unifying figure that everyone can get behind, who's sort of a larger-than-life personality and who's got real staying power in the office of prime minister. As an example, Fumio Kishida, who's stepping down now, he's been there for about 3 years now, and in Japan they think that's pretty good. They say, wow, he lasted 3 years. All right, great. So the risk of more revolving door prime ministers is something always to monitor, not less so because of policy discontinuity, but more so for the change of face at the helm of Japan that could impact relations with its neighbors.
Well, thank you so much, Chase. As always, it's great to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Emma.
For more risk insights and analyses, visit ranenetwork.com, where you can learn more about our suite of risk intelligence products and solutions. That's RANE network.com. Thanks for listening.